Hello everyone and welcome to another lesson in tonal harmony. The chord of the day today is chord 3 in major. So we're talking about chord 3 in the context of major scales. We're not talking about chord 3 in minor scales. It is not used widely in minor scales. But in major scales, it is a fun chord to use. Let's take a look in more detail at chord 3. Chord 3 is built on the third degree of the scale, so this means that the root of the chord is going to be the third degree of the scale. In C major, this means that chord 3 consists of E, G, and B. And you can clearly see that chord 3 has a lot in common with chord 1. These two chords share two tones in common. And that is true also for chords 3 and 5. They also share two tones. And you're going to later see when we start talking about what chord 3 is good for, what the function of chord 3 is, you are going to see that this quality of chord 3 sharing two tones with other chords is going to prove useful. And before we go on to the next part of the lesson, I would like to ask you a question. What degree of the scale is the fifth of chord 3? What degree of the scale is the fifth of chord 3? Now let's move on to asking, what is chord 3 good for? When do I use it? What do I use it for? In other words, we want to know what the function of that chord is. What function can it fulfill in a chord progression? So there are three functions for chord 3. One for the root position, one for the first inversion, and one for the second inversion. And we're going to talk about each of those one by one. So the first function is for chord 3 in root position. Chord 3 in root position can substitute for 1/6. So you can swap 1/6 for chord 3 if you want a different color, for example. Now the second function that we need to talk about is for 3/6. This is chord 3 in first inversion, and you will very soon see that 3/6 is the same as chord 5 with the sixth above the root of that chord instead of the fifth. So the sixth as a suspension. So 5/6 is the same as 3/6. Now the third function is for 3 in the second inversion, and 3/6/4 is a passing chord that allows for a first, seventh, sixth, fifth degree of the scale line. So if you imagine a bass line, up until now, we weren't able to write a bass line that would go stepwise down from the first to the fifth degree of the scale. But now we will be able to do that using 3/6/4. Now, there is an important thing about chord 3. Even though it includes the seventh degree of the scale, we do not treat that seventh degree of the scale as the leading tone. So chord 3 is the only one in which we will not have to remember about these rules for voice leading that apply to the leading tone. This means that when we use chord 3, even if its fifth, which is the seventh degree of the scale, finds itself in an outer voice, in the soprano or in the bass, it doesn't have to resolve up to the first degree of the scale. It doesn't have to do that. And for this reason, this is why we can have, for example, a bass line that goes like this. First the first degree of the scale and the seventh degree of the scale. Normally, if that were the leading tone of, for example, chord 5-7, we would have to resolve that leading tone going up. But if we harmonize this as chord 3, then the 7th degree of the scale doesn't have to go up. It can move by step down to the 6th degree of the scale. So 3-6-4 gives us a great advantage of being able to write a stepwise descending line from the 1st to the 5th degree of the scale. Okay, let's now talk about each of these inversions in detail. First, root position. As we just said, 3 can substitute for 1-6, and we can see a chord progression here. We start on chord 1 in C major. Then, in the second measure, we have a predominant area. Then in the third measure, we have the dominant area, and then we have the resolution to the tonic. Now, what we could have here between 1 and chord 4, what we could have is simply 1-6. We could have that, and this is what the chord would look like. We would just expand the tonic from 1 to 1-6, from the tonic in the root position to the tonic in the first inversion. We would prolong the tonic harmony, so we would be in the area of the tonic harmony, but we would change the color of the chord just very slightly by moving the bass up. Well, instead of that 1-6, we can have chord 3. Why would I want to use chord 3 instead of 1-6? Well, if I want my soprano line to go step by step from the 1st degree of the scale to the 6th degree of the scale, C, B, A, I want to use chord 3 so that this B here doesn't have to move back up. If I have chord 3 here, my B can go down by step. So, and apart from that, chord 3 has a much darker color than chord 1 in a major key, because chord 3, E, G, B, is a minor triad. So that means that if you substitute 3 for 1-6, you are adding a darker color to your chord progression while still staying in the tonic area. So 3 in root position belongs to the tonic area, but it has a darker color. To sum up, use chord 3 when you want a different color, a darker one, or if you want the 7th degree of the scale in the soprano to move down. The 7th degree of the scale here in the first measure on the 3rd beat, the 7th degree of the scale, which is the 5th of chord 3. If you want it to move down, use chord 3. Okay, let's move on to the first inversion of chord 3. As we said, chord 3, 3-6, is the same as 5 with the suspension of 6. So 5, and then in the brackets, 6. Let's take a look at this chord progression. We start on the tonic, then we have the tonic in the first inversion. Then we have our predominant area of 4-7, which then switches into 2-6-5. And then I want to have my dominant area here. And I have a couple of options. I could either just have a normal 5-7 chord. But another option would be to have 5 with the double suspension, 6-4, 5-3. this is another option. Yet another option is to have a single suspension. So this means I can either have 5 with the suspension 4 to 3, or 5 with the suspension 6 to 5. And this is the one that we have in this measure. So we are in C major, and this means that the notes of the dominant chord are G, B, and D. D is the 5th. And I want to have a suspended 6th in that chord. So I need the note that is one step above D to come instead of that D first, and that is my E. E is the 6th above the root of this chord. This is why we have 6 here. And then it's of course a foreign note. It doesn't originally belong to the chord. So this foreign note has to resolve down onto the note that actually belongs to the chord. So 6 has to go down to 5. E has to go down to D. And I would like you to notice that these notes of this chord here, G, B, and E, are the same as chord 3-6. So we could look at this harmony here, at this sound, as either chord 3-6 or as 5 with a suspended 6. But of course we are going to label it as 5 with the suspension, because after that suspension there always has to come the resolution. So we prefer to have this notation, even though theoretically what we are hearing here is chord 3-6. And there's something important about the use of 3-6 as 5 with the suspension. What's important with this chord is that we can use it in minor, because we are really no longer talking about chord 3 here. We're talking about the dominant with the suspended 6. So we can use the dominant with the suspended 6 in a minor key. Take a look at this example. I rewrote the chord progression that we just saw here in C major. I rewrote it into C minor. So we again have the tonic, then the tonic in the first inversion. Then we have the subdominant 4 with the 7th. Then we have 2-6-5. And then we move on to the dominant with the suspension 6 onto 5, and then resolving onto 1. And I would like to show you one thing, something that works really great with this chord 5-6-5, which is 5 with the suspension 6 resolving onto 5. What works great is adding the 7th to the chord in the same moment as you are resolving the suspension onto the 5th. So you want the 7th of the chord to happen simultaneously with the 5th of the chord. And we could do the same here. And I would have to add the 7th to the labeling. And the reason why I am recommending this is that this particular solution to the chord 5 with the suspension 6 onto 5 with the 7th that happens simultaneously with the 5th, this solution has been very often used by the composer whose name is Chopin. And I know that some of you like this composer a lot. So he used this very often, so often that theorists call this sonority a Chopin chord. Chopin chord. So if you want to use a Chopin chord in your own progression, use the dominant with the suspension 6 onto 5, and make sure that the 7th happens simultaneously with the 5th of chord 5. Okay, we are ready to move on to the last inversion, 3-6-4, the second inversion of chord 3. It is a passing chord that allows for a 1-7-6-5 line, which is a stepwise descending line from the 1st down to the 5th degree of the scale. And if we put that in the bass, well, we get a great result. We have never been able before to write a stepwise line like this. We always had to skip the 7th degree of the scale. So we usually saw a chord progression like this. In C major, we would start on chord 1 and we would have C in the bass as the root of chord 1. And then we would move on to, in the bass, onto the 6th degree of the scale that we could harmonize as chord 6 or chord 4-6 or 4-6-5 or 2-4-3. Any predominant chord that includes the 6th degree of the scale. And then we would move on to the dominant area and resolve onto the tonic. Now what we can do is we can actually have a note in between that C and that A. So we can have a stepwise bass line. We can go from C down through B down to A. And the good thing is that once you change the bass of chord 1 from C to B, the other notes and the other voices are safe. So E and G does not have to change. We only have to change the C into B. Okay, this is it for chord 3. We have seen how to use chord 3 in a root position, in the first inversion and in the second inversion. We have seen what the function of that chord is and how to use it in our own chord progressions. I hope it was useful, and don't forget to move on to the next part of the lesson to see how chord 3 works in practice.